So just a quick background on myself. Catherine mentioned I've been in IT projects delivery for about 14 years now. So back when I started, I was working in big clients. I thought this was exactly what you're supposed to do. So I was following the best practices for doing big projects, and that was waterfall. And it was, we'd do our requirements, and 6 months later we'd start our build, and another 6 to 9 months later, which became 12, we'd finally get something out to test, and it just something seemed a little bit wrong with this approach. It just didn't seem like we were moving fast enough, that we were delivering the value that we really should be delivering to customers. And I guess this is a journey that now it seems a bit dated, I guess, but it's just my personal journey as well, through kind of figuring out that waterfall isn't actually the most efficient way of delivering projects. And I started kind of really researching into DevOps and things like that. Now, about eight or 9 years ago, when we were trying to introduce this in those bigger enterprise companies, it had a bit of a different nickname. Everyone called it fragile, because there was no way that this new way of working could actually work. Like, there's no governance. There was just a massive amount of pushback about trialing something new, and that's just symptomatic of any form of change. People will push back against change because they're experts in what they do today, and something new is scary. So there was always this massive pushback against it. So what I did was I quit, and I went and I started a startup. So about 9 of us, eight and a half, got together, and we worked on a startup for a number of months. It was Trainers. You haven't heard of it because it's dead. But what the idea of it was that I was living in a different city at the time, and I found that if I was trying to do any training, if it was just up to me, I'd come up with every excuse. It's raining, it's a bit cold, I'm a bit tired, any form of excuse not to do it. So the concept was, if you kind of connected with somebody else and said, I'll meet you to train, then you're much more likely to do it. Peer pressure, essentially. So we worked on this for ages, and we followed that kind of DevOps approach. We got our first MVP out in about 10 days, and we just kept iterating based on feedback that we were getting. But the experience, if I could sum it up, it was kind of like this. And what I mean by this is, you can be going incredibly fast in terms of delivery, but if you're not going at your target, it's going to end up bad. And I think of the book Competing Against Luck by Clayton Christensen, and he said that, like a lot of companies, they're just stabbing in the dark. So they're just hoping, okay, maybe I'll try this. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, I'll try something else. Didn't work. And you can get lucky and get your target right, but you're competing against luck to do it. And that's where I was thinking, okay, after we decided that the startup wasn't going places, I wanted to figure out what went wrong, because I had all this experience in delivering IT software. How could we make this better? And that's where, the quote, one of my favorite quotes, this is Peter Drucker, who's one of the fathers of the science of management. And he says, there's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. And that's my thinking of companies that just go purely down the DevOps route without focusing on what their customer needs, because then, yes, it'll be like the startup. You keep going and you're very efficient and fast at doing it, but it's not the right thing to do. So I started doing a lot more research into design thinking, empathizing with the customer, understanding what the customer needs are. The whole concept of don't touch code until as late as possible. Make sure you've validated your idea that there's a need in the market for what you're trying to sell. But then I was struggling with, how do we marry this with DevOps? So I had a lot of experience in kind of delivery, but couldn't figure out how the two of these flowed together. And that's where, I guess, UXDX came from. We kind of came up with a new way of working, kind of the ceremonies, the sprints, all the different techniques and tools or methodologies of how we can integrate UX teams more efficiently into development teams to build a better product faster. So that's enough about the background. Now what I want to talk about is how I've approached change in companies. So first of all, I'm going to talk about a process, but then we'll go into specific examples, because if you're just talking about a process, it's very hard to actually get concrete value out of that until you start seeing how it's used in practice. So the first step, and this is the one that I've learned the hard way, is you have to agree on the problems. So what I mean by that is, in any organization, in their delivery, there's problems in multiple places in the delivery cycle. But if you jump straight in and tell people, you know what we need to do is we need an automated pipeline here, and we need kind of automated infrastructure. No infrastructure can be touched. It has to be all code and all these things. People are going to push back. It's back to that fragile thing I said at the start. If they don't accept that there's a problem today, they're not going to accept the solution that you're proposing. So you first have to highlight to everybody that there is a problem. So what I do is I say, you need to highlight the bottlenecks. So map out the process the whole way from when a story comes in, a new idea gets thought of, that this is a good idea, this is something that can help our product. Track that the whole way through your hypothesis, your prototyping, doing your initial build, testing, deploying it, releasing, until it actually gets into the hands of your customers. And find out where the biggest bottleneck there is. Because, well, just before we get on to the biggest bottleneck, sorry, the thing about change as well is there's twofold. If people don't agree on the problem, they're not going to support you. But the other one is, if you start asking around and going, okay, how long does that take? So, okay, so it moves into this stream, and okay, it sits in a backlog for 2 months there, and then we move it into test, and okay, it takes 3 months to get through test, and you're mapping it out. You're instantly going to get people on the defensive. So there's a kind of a psychological thing about, there's an axis that people are on. They're either defensive, in which they're closed and they're going to protect themselves, or they're in discovery mode, where they're open to new ideas. And the only way you can get people into discovery mode is you make them feel comfortable. But if you start going around and asking people, how long does that take? And it really sits there for 3 months, that doesn't seem very good. They're instantly going to become defensive. So you just need to, when you are trying to find out where your biggest bottlenecks are, you just need to be conscious that you don't want people to feel like you're accusing them of something wrong. It's try and make them feel comfortable. Explain that you're just trying to understand the process, and it's separating the person from the process. Now, with targeting the biggest bottleneck, so if you've mapped out everything in the whole end-to-end process, and there's going to be problems everywhere, but what you want to do is target the biggest one. And that's from a thing called Little's Law, which is about queue theory. It's kind of how quickly can you get through a queue. And it's a very simple equation. You look at the work in progress and divide it by the average throughput. So if you take the example of, let's say your bottleneck is in development. So it takes 6 months. Every idea goes into a backlog for 6 months before it can get out into customers' hands. And then you go, okay, but I work in the UX team, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to improve the UX team and make that more efficient. That 6-month backlog is going to become 7, 8, 9 months. And then what's going to happen is management are going to be faced with a choice. They can either increase development people, but that costs more budget, or they can reduce UX people, which is easier to do. So you can actually, by optimizing in the wrong place, you can have pretty unintended consequences. So it's important to figure out where the biggest bottleneck is, and don't optimize ahead of that, because you're going to cause more trouble than you're actually solving. Because what you do then is you increase the work in progress. So now that you've agreed on your biggest bottlenecks, and it's worthwhile, you don't have to just pick one. You can pick multiple, because there's always a lot of problems. But just make sure that you're not excluding your biggest ones, that you are targeting those ones. And then you need to agree on the solution. Again, back to kind of personal experience, and I'll go into detail in a second. I'm guilty of rushing in with, this is the solution. Okay, we're all agreed on the problem. This is how we fix it. Let's go. And I would put that into the kind of the middle box there, the imposed vision, where you're kind of saying, okay, this is the way it needs to happen, but you haven't brought everybody on the journey yet. So they're still going, well, there could be 2 or 3 other ways of doing this. I'm not sure this is the right way to do it. You're just going to get that opposition as you go and you try change it. So again, it can feel quite slow going through this process, but you want to make it almost their idea. So if you're talking to somebody and in their area, that's the biggest bottleneck, just kind of try tease it out of them that, oh, what about this idea, or what about that idea? And try and make it that it's their idea in the end. It's their solution, because that's the way that you're actually going to get progress. And then incremental change. So the other biggest kind of pushback that I always get when I'm kind of doing it, because you do start with number one over there in the corner, which is, this is the nirvana. This is exactly how I want it to work. So this is following, you're going to hear a lot of best practices today, and you want to implement those in your companies, but that's the nirvana. That's kind of a little bit away. Then you figure out all your current conditions. So that's where you are today. And there's quite a gap between the two of those. So the biggest pushback you'll get is, realistically, we can't get there. That's too far for us. There's too much change in order to make that jump. So what you do is you put in, what's the next best condition? So this is stolen from Toyota katas. Toyota being lean manufacturing, kind of they came up with the approach. And how they did it was they used these katas, and they were put up visibly everywhere. So everyone can see, okay, here's our current condition, here's our next step, and here's our nirvana. And every time they would get closer to the next step, they'd move it along, but it was visible to everybody. And the reason they did that was because then change became part of the culture. Instead of change being this scary thing, it was visual. Everybody was always moving to the next step, and change started to become more ingrained in the culture, which just made it easier and quicker to implement further change. And the last step, because I've mentioned this is a slow process, you have to take people along with you. You have to just have persistence, because it does feel like you're making no progress. I keep a little diary of, okay, a month ago I had a conversation with somebody and they flat out refused it, thought it was crazy. Last week, they were kind of going, okay, might not be too bad. This week they're saying, okay, we've got a problem, so I've gotten to the problem points. Now we just need to keep going. So even though it feels like you've made no progress, you're changing people's mindsets. And it is unfortunately something that takes time. So that's just a kind of a generic process. So I'm going to dig in now into a bit of detail on how I've done this in 2 organizations. So as Catherine mentioned, I've been working for a number of years with Ryanair, and I worked in back office systems at Ryanair. So I'm going to talk about a few differences there. Whereas at Aer Lingus, I work on the mobile teams, web teams, the API teams. So it's all the front of office teams. So there's some subtle differences between the two. So first of all, the 3 biggest problems that I've seen in both of these places can be categorized into these groups. So the shared vision. And I'm going to jump into each of these in more detail. But the lack of, if you asked everybody on the team, what are we trying to achieve? You would get very different answers from different people, and some people would be, they wouldn't even know. They wouldn't be able to answer the question of what we're trying to achieve. The UX dev barriers, just traditionally kind of silos between teams. UX might sit in marketing, dev in IT, and how can we get that a bit closer? And then quick feedback, because a lot of UX is all about, okay, well, I've got an idea. I don't know if it's right. So until I can actually test that idea, I won't know, I won't be able to learn from that. I won't be able to figure out, was that a good assumption? Was it a bad assumption? So you need quick feedback in order to be able to tell whether it's working. So on the shared vision, what was kind of consistent in my experience is the UX team have a pretty good overview of what's going on. There's gaps. There's not a perfect understanding of what needs to be done, but they would have a general overview of the direction where the product needs to go. But the developers get one piece of the puzzle. They just get told, okay, here's a feature, go build it. And they lack the context of where this fits in the overall thing. And the biggest problem there is there's always options when you're building something. There's always kind of, do I do it in, like I could do it in option A, go build it this way, or option B a different way. And what ends up happening is they go, okay, I'll build it option B because it's quicker. Next piece of the puzzle comes along and it's like, crap, should have gone option A. And I'm sure you've all heard it. It then, okay, now it's going to take me a week to undo what I did, and I'm going to have to go back, and now it's going to take twice as long. So the lack of a shared vision causes real problems in terms of actually getting products out the door. So what we did in both organizations, the same kind of thing, a traditional design thinking approach, get everybody into a room and lots of colored sticky notes. And by everybody, I mean we got all the stakeholders. So in Ryanair in the back office, it was all the people who schedule flights, operated flights, the commercial team thinking about new routes, the operations team who managed disruptions. Got all of those representatives into the room, and our team, so all of our developers, our QA, our designers. And we mapped out, and we actually ran two different types of workshops. So with Ryanair, it was all the front office, or sorry, Aer Lingus was the front office people, the marketing, the retail, the digital experience. It was very similar if you looked at them from the outside, but quite different how we ran those workshops. So with the front-facing system, we did a jobs to be done workshop. And can I get a quick show of hands? Who's heard of jobs to be done? Okay, so 40% maybe, roughly. So for those who don't know, jobs to be done is it's a kind of a way of thinking about problems that if I take the example of Aer Lingus, because this is where we ran this workshop, the way Aer Lingus is structured, there's product teams. So one product team looks after fares, one team looks after seats and bags, one team looks after car hire and hotels. So they're all thinking, okay, I need to sell a seat, I need to sell a fare, a cheap fare, or something like that. But a customer isn't buying those things individually. A customer wants to get from A to B. That's it. That's what they're buying. That's their job to be done. And the classic example is a drill. So you might be selling a drill and you're saying, okay, it's got an ergonomic handle, it's got dual speed, and it's got all of these fancy widgets, but your customer just wants a hole in their wall. And they just want to know, will this drill put a hole in the wall so I can hang up a picture frame? So what we did actually, how we ran that session is we mapped out the customer journey, the customer life cycle. And we then started thinking about what are they trying to achieve at each point in this customer life cycle. And what that did was it was actually transformative in terms of making people shift their mindset from being solely focused on their products, their kind of the fare or the seat or the bag, and starting to think more about where the customer is in their journey and what the most efficient or effective thing for that customer is at that point in time. The other session, because this was a back office session, we actually ran it a little different because unfortunately we didn't even have a UX team when we started this project because it was back office. We weren't going to increase conversions. The stickiness of the product wasn't a problem. We weren't going to kind of go viral or anything. The people had to use it. So there was management at the time said, well, there's no point in investing in this because, well, it just has to be used. We already have a system. We're just doing a system replacement. How difficult can it be? So after a few months of going down bad kind of dead ends and having to rework things as we went along, we decided we needed to get back to that shared vision. So we ran an event storming session. And event storming is you get orange stickies or whatever color you want, and you put up every event. So for this, it was, okay, I want to create a new flight. I want to schedule that flight in an airport. I want to get a slot for that flight. I want to take off, land, disembark. So all the events that happen as you go through. And then you put in the triggers for the events, and then the people who trigger those events. And we got all the different departments that barely talk to each other. And two really important things came out of that session. One was the different departments understood the pain they were causing the next department in the handover. So they would see, okay, so when it gets handed over, the people do a week's worth of work to get a bit of information that the first team could have just handed to them. So these kind of just inefficiencies in the process. And the second thing, because this was such a huge system, the developers needed to know how to modularize it. We couldn't build one huge application because it would be very inefficient. So we wanted to build lots of smaller applications. But they didn't know where to draw the boundaries. And we started by drawing them along the department boundaries, but that was completely wrong. So what we found after doing this session was it actually became apparent where the natural boundaries were from the data point of view, where we could say, okay, so that fits within one of the modules, this fits in another. And it just made it a lot more efficient and modular in the end solution. So that was about trying to achieve the shared vision. Breaking down the barriers, the easy answer is get everybody onto the shared team. I'm going to ask another question. How many people here are from kind of large enterprises? Actually, it's small numbers. So most people are in startups? Okay, so
Phew, 1,000 people. I don't know, arbitrary number. I guess in smaller startups, you tend to actually be already working in kind of small teams because there hasn't been that kind of need to start compartmentalizing and departmentalizing companies. The larger a company gets, it seems to be, okay, well, now we have to start, instead of just being one team, we have to start saying, okay, this is marketing and this is IT. And so the challenges then become, you've got departments, priorities, and politics. So what happens is, for an example, in Aer Lingus, we do work together in one team until there's a problem. And then everyone retreats back to their department and starts pointing fingers at each other. So it's not the most efficient way of doing it. So ideally, you want everybody working as one team, but that isn't always possible. Keep pushing, keep trying to get everybody onto the same team, because then you have the communication is just so much more efficient. But otherwise, if you can get that shared vision, then the miscommunication drops anyway, because everybody knows what's trying to be achieved. So there aren't as many miscommunication things happening anyway. And then finally, onto the quick feedback. There's kind of two things I look at when I think quick feedback. One is about being outcome focused. So what I mean by this is a lot of companies do, they come up with a feature and then they break that feature by components. And the problem with that is you have nothing until you have the whole feature. Whereas if you think of the outcome, you can start building it incrementally. And then DevOps, obviously you need to be able to get your code into customers' hands quickly to test your hypothesis to see, okay, is this working? Is it not working? Is this a valid assumption? So just on the outcome focused, I don't know if you've seen this picture before. Whenever I show it to people, they're like, yeah, that's great. But that will never work where I work, because our features are too complex and there's no way that we could possibly do this in our place. So we're just going to have to go with build the car in the stages. So for those of you who haven't seen it before, the top line is saying you're going to build the wheels and then the chassis, and eventually you get the car at the end, but you have nothing until you get it all. Whereas the bottom, I need to get the outcome of a car is I want to get to A to B, from A to B faster than walking. So a skateboard gets me from A to B faster than walking. Scooter does, bike does, etc. It's getting better the whole time, but it does achieve my outcome early. And what I really like about this slide is it shows at the end, your product is different. If you follow the outcome approach, you will end up with a different product at the end than if you had just built it all up front, because you'll have learned from your customer as you go. So you'll end up with your convertible instead of your classic sedan. And then with the top approach, the biggest problem with doing this is company priorities can change at any time. So you could get cut off halfway through. You might not learn from the customer. And if you stop at any point before the end, you've delivered no value at all, which is waste. So with outcome focus, because as I said, people say, oh, there's no way, my problems are too complex. There's no way that we could possibly break it down. So I like to use the example of an eye. And an eye was used, the reason I chose this is because this was one of the arguments against evolution. An eye couldn't evolve because an eye is so complex and half an eye is useless. If you chopped an eye in half, it would provide no value. So how could an eye possibly evolve? So it's the same as kind of a feature in your organization. The end product is so complex that how could you make it up from simple things? So what you have to do is just ask why. Why do we want this? What value is this going to deliver? So the most basic thing an eye can do is just detect light. So I can see it's bright or it's dark. I can see what direction that light is coming in, so I can retreat into the darkness to hide from a predator. Or I can see shapes, so I don't bump into things. Then I want to be able to focus on those shapes, so I know, okay, that's a dangerous shape or that's a not dangerous shape. And then finally, I want to be able to look at something close to me and look at something far away, so I can determine if there's something dangerous close or far away. So if you think about what's trying to be achieved, you can actually break down even the most complex things into increments. And then on DevOps, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to actually implement DevOps properly. I'm not going to jump into it because from my experience, most companies are already investing in this. The biggest problem I've seen is people investing in the outcomes. They think if they just accelerate DevOps, that will be the problem solved. And I think it's actually back to my point earlier. If you're building the wrong thing, you're competing against luck, you're stabbing in the dark. You need to make sure what you're building is the right thing. So what outcomes have I personally achieved by following this process and trying to implement this model in Ryanair and Aer Lingus? So the first one is the product ownership changed. So after we did that jobs to be done, there's no longer, or it's in the process of changing. So people are moving from being the product owner for fares and bags and seats to you have the Inspire product owner. You have the searching product owner, the booking product owner, the day of travel product owner. So it's following the customer on their journey through the life cycle. And it just means that it can be a lot more targeted and focused on what the customer needs at any point in time. There's metrics everywhere. So when we go down that outcome-focused approach, we basically take a story, a classic, as a user, I want to do this so that I can, and we throw in an extra line, and I'll know I'm right when. And we put a metric in there. So that means that, because what always happens is people fall back into the component focus. And if you think about, okay, I've built a wheel, and I know that's providing value when it won't provide value. So you won't be able to put a metric to it. So you'll realize that you're falling down that component thinking way. Whereas with a skateboard, you'll be able to say, okay, I know I'm providing value because 2% of my customers have taken it up. We know it's crap, but it provides some value over something that's not there at all. So, okay, 2% shows that there's value there. If I make it a bit better, hopefully I'll get to 5%. And you can just be testing the whole way. And maybe it doesn't. Maybe you get 0% uplift. And that's learning as well, because that tells you maybe our customers don't care about this. Maybe we should kill it here and not waste more time investing in it. And the problems have been agreed. So as I was saying, it's kind of agree on the problems, agree on the solution. We've gotten to the point where we agree on a lot of the problems. The solutions are still under debate a little bit. But as I said, these things take time. So that is progress. And it's good to remember, if you are trying to do any change initiatives, keep track of this progress, because it can seem like you're not making any otherwise. So actions to take away. Identify the bottlenecks across the whole process. So don't just focus in one area. Try find where the biggest bottleneck is, because if you optimize in the wrong area, you can actually make things worse. Don't go it alone. So sometimes if you're trying to do all these change things, it can seem like you're on your own swimming up against the stream. So that's why get people involved, get them to take ownership of the solution, because that's the way that it's going to actually drive it through. A lot of times people are so busy that they can't actually look up to see what's wrong. So a lot of times when you see this, it's kind of the modes of a team. Teams are either in survivorship mode or they're in learning mode. And if they're in survivorship mode, they're just constant deadlines, have to get it out, and they can't think about ways to improve what they're doing. They're just constantly focusing on getting the next release out or getting something fixed. So you need to identify when teams are like that and suggest that they get some breathing room to come back, analyze it. So that's working with management to give them a break, basically. And then persistence pays off. So as I've said a few times, you just have to keep battling on if you're trying to make change happen, but it does work over time. The last thing I'm going to leave you with then is, so I've kind of worked on this from the examples of my experience, but also I've been running UXDX for a couple of years now. And so at the conferences, there's always good speakers talking about their experiences that I learned from, and also talking to all the people at the breaks. So I'll be hanging around here at the breaks, but also if I don't get a chance to talk to you, if you want to email me with any questions or thoughts or your experiences, I'd really appreciate that, because I can always learn a bit more. And we'll move to questions.